The barista turned around before I even finished saying my order and said it back to me word for word. Oat milk, extra shot, 1 pump of cinnamon, no whip. I hadn't ordered that drink from her in 14 years. I hadn't ordered it from anyone since high school. And when she looked up and our eyes actually met, I realized the girl behind that counter wasn't just some barista who'd guessed lucky. It was Grace Sullivan, the girl I never had the courage to tell I loved. Welcome back to our channel. My name is Nathan Cole. I'm 32, and up until that morning, I would have told you I'd made peace with the version of my life I ended up with. I designed timber frame additions and porch conversions for a small architecture firm 2 towns over from where I grew up. I moved back here 8 months earlier after my dad had a scare with his heart. Nothing fatal, but enough to make a grown man reconsider what he was doing 3 states away from his parents for a job that never once asked how they were doing. I packed up my apartment in Denver, put my furniture in storage, and moved back into my childhood bedroom like a man starting his life over at 31. My friends called it noble. My mother called it overdue. I mostly called it exhausting. I hadn't planned on the cafe. I'd meant to keep driving straight to the hardware store for paint samples, but the sign outside said Sullivan's, and something in the back of my skull tugged at that name before I understood why. I parked without really deciding to. I walked in without really deciding to, either. That's the thing about a hometown. It makes decisions for you sometimes, using memories you didn't know you still had. The place was small, warm, the kind of cafe with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that somebody clearly redrew by hand every week. I got in line behind 2 teenagers arguing about oat milk versus almond milk like the fate of the republic depended on it, and when I finally stepped up to the counter, I started to say, "Can I get a what?" And that's when she said it for me. I stood there for a full 3 seconds, just staring. She had the same brown eyes I remembered from a decade and a half ago, the same habit of tilting her head slightly when she was studying someone's face, trying to place them. Her hair was shorter now, tied back under a green apron with Sullivan stitched across the chest in cream thread. She looked older, obviously, the way we all do, but she looked like herself in a way that made my chest do something uncomfortable and immediate. "Nathan," she said slowly, like she was testing whether the name still fit. "Grace." My voice came out rougher than I meant it to. "You still remember my order?" She laughed, and it was the exact same laugh, unchanged by 14 years, low and a little surprised at itself. "I remember a lot of things. You used to come in every Tuesday after cross-country practice and order the same thing every single time, like you were afraid of what would happen if you tried something new." "That's slander. That's memory," she said. "I have a good one. Occupational hazard of working the same counter since I was 17. I glanced around the shop, at the chalk menu, the little corkboard covered in flyers for piano lessons and lost cats, the mural of a coffee cup with wings painted on the far wall that I was almost certain hadn't been there when we were teenagers. "You own this place?" "Since my mom retired 3 years ago." She said it simply, the way people say things they've said many times before, worn smooth from repetition. "Same cafe, new management." I didn't move for a second. The line behind me shifted impatiently. Somebody cleared their throat, and Grace glanced past my shoulder and then back at me with an expression that had a whole conversation hidden inside it. "I should let you get back to work," I said. "Probably," she agreed. Then, before I turned to go, she added, "Same table by the window still open, if you want to sit a while. Drinks on the house, reunion tax." I sat by that window for 45 minutes longer than I meant to, and I didn't do a single thing productive with my morning, and I did not regret it once. I want to be honest about something. I wasn't a coward my entire life, just about her. In high school, Grace Sullivan and I had worked the same summer job at this exact cafe, back when her parents ran it and hired half the junior class to bus tables and pull espresso shots badly. We'd worked more closing shifts together than I could count. I used to walk her to her car afterward under the excuse that the parking lot lighting was bad, which was true, but was also the thinnest possible cover for the fact that I just wanted 5 extra minutes with her. I never told her. Senior year ended, she went to art school 2 states away, I went to a state school for engineering, and the kind of connection that only exists in proximity dissolved the way those things do when nobody fights to keep it. I heard through mutual friends over the years that she'd come back home for a while to help care for her mother during a rough health stretch, that she never went back to finish her art degree, that she took over the family business instead. I never asked for more details than that. It felt like reading someone else's diary. I went back to Sullivan's the next morning, told myself it was because the coffee was good, which it was, and that had nothing to do with anything else, which was a lie I believed for approximately 11 minutes before Grace came out from behind the counter with my drink already made and sat down across from me like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You're going to become a regular again, aren't you?" she said. It wasn't a question. "I have very consistent taste in coffee." "You have very consistent taste in general," she said, and there was something a little sharp under the words, not unkind, just observant in the way she'd always been. Same order, same seat by the window. Some things really don't change. Some things should probably change more than they have. She looked at me for a second too long, and I felt the years collapse a little between us, the way they sometimes do with people who knew you before you became whoever you currently are. "How long are you back for?" she asked. "Indefinitely. My dad had some health stuff, figured it was time to stop being 3 states away from people who matter." Her expression softened in a way I felt in my sternum. "I'm sorry, is he okay?" "He's stubborn, which the doctor says is a good sign, oddly." She smiled at that, and for a second we just sat there, two people who used to know each other extremely well, trying to figure out how much of that still applied. I started coming in most mornings after that. Not every single day, because I didn't want to look as obvious as I felt, but often enough that the other staff started calling me by name before I'd even ordered. I learned things about her life in pieces, the way you learn a house by living in it room by room instead of getting the whole floor plan at once. Her mother's health had stabilized years ago, but by then Grace had already restructured her whole life around this cafe, around this town, around obligations that never quite let her get back to the version of herself that used to fill sketchbooks in study hall. She still drew, she told me once, mostly on napkins now, mostly for nobody. "You were good," I said, "like actually good, not high school good, actually good." "I was 17, everyone thinks their friends are talented at 17. "I wasn't your friend giving you a compliment out of loyalty," I said. "I was a boy who barely spoke to you outside of closing shifts, and even I noticed." Something crossed her face then, quick, unreadable, gone before I could name it. "You noticed a lot of things back then," she said. "You just never said most of them out loud." I didn't have a good response to that. I still don't, if I'm honest, all these months later. Some doors you don't get to walk back through and correct, you just get to notice you left them closed. About 3 weeks into my new habit of showing up at Sullivan's like it was a job I hadn't been hired for, I met Brian. He came in around 10 on a Thursday, wearing a blazer that looked like it cost more than my monthly rent, and an expression that suggested he considered the cafe beneath him, but was willing to tolerate it because Grace was there. He didn't order anything. He walked straight past the line, past the 2 customers waiting, straight to the counter where Grace was steaming milk, and said, loud enough for half the shop to hear, "You said you'd be ready by 10. We have the tasting at 11. Grace didn't look up right away. "I have a shop full of customers, Brian. You have employees for that." He gestured vaguely at Ashley, the college kid working the register, like she was a piece of equipment, rather than a person standing 3 feet away listening to every word. "That's what they're for." I watched Grace's shoulders go tight in a way I recognized instantly, because I'd watched people brace themselves like that before, at other tables, in other rooms, and it never meant anything good. "I'll be there," she said evenly. "I need 20 minutes. "You needed 20 minutes 20 minutes ago." He checked his watch, an expensive one, the kind men wear specifically so other men will notice it. Then his eyes landed on me, sitting at my window table with my cooling coffee, and something calculating passed behind them. "And who's this?" "A regular," Grace said, too quickly. "Nathan," I said, because I wasn't going to let her introduce me like I was furniture either. Brian's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "Well, Nathan, hope you enjoy your coffee, because my fiancé has a wedding tasting to get to." Fiancé. The word landed in my chest like a dropped plate. I hadn't asked. Somehow, in 3 weeks of morning conversations, it had never come up, or maybe it had come up in some careful, sideways way I'd been too busy being happy to notice. "Congratulations," I said, because it was the only word available to me that wasn't a lie and wasn't the whole truth either. Grace didn't look at me. She untied her apron, handed it to Ashley, and followed Brian out the door with the particular walk of someone who had learned, a long time ago, that the fastest way through an uncomfortable moment is to just get through it. I sat there with my coffee going cold and thought about the fact that I'd spent 3 weeks rebuilding a friendship, or maybe something more than a friendship, with a woman who was engaged to a man who talked to her employees like appliances and to her like a schedule he was managing. I almost stopped coming in after that. I told myself it was the respectful thing to do. Instead, I came back the next morning, because respect and cowardice sometimes wear the same coat, and I wasn't entirely sure which one I was wearing. She apologized the next day, unprompted, setting my coffee down and sitting across from me like she needed to get the words out before she lost her nerve. "That was embarrassing," she said, "for everyone involved. I'm sorry you had to see that. You don't have to apologize to me for how someone else acts." "I know." She wrapped both hands around her own cup, not drinking, just holding it. "I still feel like I do." I chose my next words carefully, the way you choose your footing on a roof you're not sure will hold your weight. "Can I ask how long?" 2 years dating, engaged since Christmas. She said it flatly, the way people recite facts they've stopped examining. "He's a financial consultant, successful. My mother likes him." That wasn't the question. Her eyes came up to mine. "No," she admitted, "it wasn't." I didn't push further. I'd learned that much, at least in 14 years, that some doors open on their own timeline, and pushing on them too early just makes people shut them harder. So I let it sit. I asked about her day instead, about a new espresso machine she was trying to justify buying, about a mural some local kid wanted to paint on the side wall facing the alley. We talked for 20 minutes about things that had nothing to do with Brian, and by the time I left, her shoulders had come down from where they'd been sitting near her ears since the day before. I didn't try to be more than a friend. I want that on the record. I wasn't trying to pull anyone away from anyone, but I also didn't stop showing up, and I didn't stop noticing the way her whole posture changed depending on whether she was talking to me or talking about Brian, and I think some part of both of us understood exactly what that meant, even if neither of us said it out loud. Brian came in twice more over the following month. Both times he treated the cafe like an inconvenience he was tolerating for Grace's sake, both times he barely acknowledged the staff, and both times he looked at me with the particular suspicion of a man who senses a threat he can't quite name yet. The third time, he waited until Grace stepped into the back to grab more cups, and he sat down across from me uninvited, resting his forearms on the table like he owned it. "You're here a lot," he said. "Good coffee." "That's it?" I met his eyes. I wasn't going to lie to him, but I also wasn't going to hand him a war he hadn't earned yet. Grace and I knew each other in high school. We reconnected. That's the whole story. Reconnected, he said the word like it tasted bad. "You know she's marrying me in September." I heard. "So you'll understand if I'd prefer you found a different coffee shop." I leaned back slightly. "This is her shop, Brian, not yours. I don't think that's your call to make." Something flickered across his face, ugly and quick, gone before Grace came back out carrying a tray of clean mugs. He stood, smoothed his blazer, and said something to her about needing to leave for a work call, then walked out without so much as a goodbye to me. Grace watched him go, then looked at me with a question in her eyes she didn't ask out loud. "He wants me to stop coming here," I said, because I wasn't going to hide it from her. Her jaw tightened. "That's not his decision. That's what I told him." She set the tray down harder than the mugs probably deserved. "I'm sorry, he's been..." She stopped herself, exhaled, started again. "He's been different lately, more controlling. I keep telling myself it's wedding stress." "Is it?" She didn't answer right away, and that silence told me more than any sentence could have. Everything came apart on a Saturday in July, 3 weeks before the wedding date. I wasn't there when it started. I walked in near the end of it, drawn in by raised voices audible through the front window, before I even got to the door. Brian stood at the counter with 2 men in suits I didn't recognize, potential investors, I'd learn later. Men he wanted to impress by showing off his fiancé's cute little café, as though it were a personal accessory. He'd apparently promised them a private tasting that Grace knew nothing about, expecting her to drop everything on a Saturday, her busiest day, to cater to men she'd never met. "This is completely unprofessional," Brian was saying, loud enough that 3 tables of customers had gone quiet to listen. "I told you this mattered to me." "You told me 20 minutes ago," Grace shot back, her voice tight but controlled. "I have a full shop, Brian. I can't just abandon my customers because you decided to show up unannounced with clients. It's a coffee shop, Grace, not open heart surgery. Ashley can handle it." Ashley is 19 and it's her first solo Saturday. I am not leaving her alone during peak hours because you want to impress people over lattes. One of the men in suits laughed, an awkward, uncomfortable sound, and said something about maybe rescheduling. Brian's face went red in the particular way of a man who felt humiliated in front of an audience he'd wanted to impress, and the words that came out of him next were quieter, but somehow worse. "This is exactly the problem," he said. "You'd rather stand behind a counter pulling shots for strangers than support me for 1 hour. Do you understand how that looks? Do you understand what people think when my fiancé can't even step away from a coffee shop for her own future?" The whole cafe had gone silent by then. Ashley stood frozen near the register. And Grace? Grace just stood there for a second, absorbing it, the way I'd watched her absorb things before, bracing without breaking. That's when I stepped in. I'm not proud of the fact that I couldn't stop myself, but I also can't say I regret it. "Hey," I said, walking up beside the counter. "Maybe don't do this here." Brian turned on me like he'd been waiting for an excuse. "This isn't your business." "You're standing in her business," I said, yelling at her in front of her customers and her employee. "That kind of makes it everyone's business." "Nathan," Grace said quietly, a warning, or maybe something else. "I'm not trying to start anything," I told her, and meant it. Then I looked back at Brian. "I'm just saying, whatever you two need to work out, this isn't the place, and this definitely isn't how you talk to someone you're supposed to be marrying." Brian's jaw worked for a second. His two investors looked deeply uncomfortable, like men who'd wandered into a fight that wasn't theirs and desperately wanted the exit. "You know what?" Brian said, low and cold. "I think you've been circling this place a lot longer than you're letting on." "Maybe," I said, "but that's got nothing to do with the fact that you just embarrassed her in front of a room full of strangers because your Saturday plans got inconvenienced." For a second I thought he might actually swing at me. Instead he grabbed his jacket off the back of a chair, muttered something to his investors about finding somewhere quieter, and walked out without looking at Grace once. The bell over the door rang too loudly in the silence he left behind. Grace stood very still for a moment. Then she looked at me, and there wasn't gratitude in her expression, not exactly. There was something closer to exhaustion, and underneath that, something that looked almost like relief. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. I could have handled him. I know that too." I softened my voice. "I just wasn't going to sit there and watch him do that to you and pretend it wasn't happening." She exhaled slowly, glanced around at the customers pretending very hard not to have watched the entire thing, and managed a tired half-smile at Ashley, who looked like she needed a hug. "I need 5 minutes," Grace said to no one in particular, and walked into the back room. I gave her the 5 minutes. Then I gave her 10 more, just to be sure. When I finally knocked gently on the doorframe of the little office in back, she was sitting on an overturned crate, staring at nothing. "You okay?" I asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I think I've known for a while that something was wrong. I just kept telling myself it was stress, or timing, or my own fault for not communicating better." She looked up at me. Watching him do that in front of everyone made it very hard to keep telling myself that. I didn't say anything. I'd learned that much, at least. "He called me your usual type of exhausting," she said quietly. "A month ago, during an argument about the venue. He said I make everything harder than it needs to be because I care too much about small things, like whether Ashley's mom could get childcare for her shift, or whether the new hire felt comfortable enough to ask questions." Her voice cracked slightly. "He said that like it was a flaw." "It's not a flaw," I said. "It's the exact reason this place has people lined up out the door every morning. It's the reason your staff would probably walk through fire for you." She looked at me for a long moment. "Why does that mean more coming from you than it did coming from me?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe because I'm not asking you to change anything about yourself to hear it." Something in her face shifted then, quiet and permanent, like a decision finally settling into place after circling for a long time. She didn't say anything else that day about Brian, and I didn't ask. She called off the wedding 11 days later. I didn't find out from her directly. I found out because Ashley mentioned it in passing, careful and a little awkward, like she wasn't sure if it was information she was supposed to share. I didn't go to the cafe that day. I figured Grace deserved space that didn't have my face attached to it. She texted me that evening instead. 4 words. "Can we talk tonight?" We met at the cafe after closing. The lights dimmed except for the ones over the counter, chairs already stacked on tables by Ashley before she'd left for the night. Grace sat across from me at the same window table where this whole thing had started, and for a while neither of us said anything. I gave the ring back yesterday, she finally said. It felt like giving back a very expensive apology for something I never should have accepted in the first place. How do you feel? Lighter, she said, and looked almost surprised at her own answer. Scared. My mother's going to have opinions, but mostly lighter. I'm sorry it took something that public to see it clearly. Don't be. She wrapped her hands around an empty mug out of habit. I think I saw it a long time before that. I just needed someone standing next to me who wasn't afraid of him to make me trust what I already knew. I didn't say anything right away because I wanted to choose the next words carefully, the way you choose them when you know they might change the shape of everything. I need to tell you something, I said, and I need you to know I'm not saying it because of the timing. I've wanted to say it since about the second morning I walked back into this place. She went very still. I loved you in high school, I said. I never said it, because I was 17 and terrified, and by the time I worked up the courage, you'd already left for art school, and the moment had passed. And I've thought about that more times over the years than I'd like to admit. Her eyes were bright but steady. Nathan, I'm not saying this to complicate your week, I said quickly. I'm saying it because I don't want to walk back out of this cafe and let another 14 years go by wondering what would have happened if I'd just said it the first time. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then she reached across the table and set her hand over mine, and it was the first time she'd touched me since I'd walked back into her life a few months earlier. I remembered your order, she said quietly, because I used to hope you'd walk back through that door one day. I just never let myself say that out loud either. Neither of us kissed anyone that night. It felt too soon, too tangled up in everything she was still untangling from. But she asked me to stay a little longer while she finished closing up, and I did. And it was the first time in 14 years that the space between us felt like it was finally being filled instead of avoided. We took it slow, deliberately, carefully. She needed time to be single before she was anything else, and I respected that more than I can explain. We started with coffee that wasn't tied to my regular order, then dinner, then long walks that had nothing urgent about them at all. Her mother took some convincing. She'd liked Brian's suits and his steady job more than she understood what he was actually like behind them. But Grace held her ground gently and firmly, the same way she held her ground with everyone who tried to tell her who she should be. A year later, I helped her repaint the mural on the alley wall, the one the local kid never got around to finishing. 2 years after that, she finally picked her sketchbook back up, seriously this time, and started selling small watercolor prints of the cafe itself in a little rack by the register. They sold out within a week. She cried a little the first time and pretended it was just dust in the air. 3 years after the morning she said my order back to me before I'd even asked, I proposed at the same window table during a slow Tuesday afternoon, with Ashley pretending very hard not to watch from behind the counter. Grace said yes before I'd even finished the sentence, then made me finish it anyway because she wanted, in her words, the whole story, not just the ending.
We got married the following spring.
Her mother cried through the entire ceremony and told anyone who would listen that she'd known all along, which wasn't true, but grandmothers get to rewrite history a little. These days, when people ask how we found our way back to each other, Grace tells it simply. She says I walked back into her cafe after 14 years, and she just happened to remember what I like to drink. I always add the same thing after that some people stay in your memory exactly where you left them, waiting for you to finally be brave enough to walk back through the door. Has anyone from your past ever remembered something about you that surprised you? Something small that told you they'd never really stopped thinking about you? And if you ever got a second chance with someone you never told the truth to the first time around, would you take it? Tell me in the comments, I read every one. And if this story meant something to you, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.